It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. It's time for Monster Mondays to boldly go. And yes, that means for the first time ever on this series, I'm looking at something from the Star Trek universe. But before we truly dive in, I think I need to set some backstory here. A while back, I did a whole month of episodes from Doctor Who, and in particular, the second Doctor's Cybermen episodes. And during that month, in one of the episodes, I mentioned the Borg and probably even drew that weird feedback loop of Doctor Who having cybernetic villains who upgrade themselves to remove inefficiencies like flesh and free independent thought, which sometimes led to them wanting to potentially assimilate other races. Then Star Trek would later adopt the same idea to create the Borg, who would go around and assimilate other beings to remove their inefficiencies and add their best elements to the collective. Only for Doctor Who in the new Who era of the 21st century to lean even heavier into the concept of cybernetic beings that would assimilate organic creatures, especially humans, into the cyber collective. And at that point, I made a mental note to someday cover the Borg more specifically and with some closer examination, and that time is now. This summer, I spent time catching up on TV shows, and it's time to dive into Star Trek: The Next Generation's most feared, or at least for a time, most feared, villains of them all, the Borg. So, for the entire month of August, I'm going to discuss the 4 stories that featured the baddies, because after all, resistance is futile. So let's talk about what was going on in Star Trek in the 80s. And to start, we need to go all the way back to the original series of Star Trek that ran from 1966 to 1969. It has one of the most interesting behind-the-scenes stories of any show to ever air in the United States. It was one of the only series to ever have 2 pilots. The first, The Cage, was sent back for retooling, having been deemed too cerebral for the average audience. The skeleton was there. The crew of the USS Enterprise explored strange new worlds and sought out new life and new civilizations. However, aside from the premise, the Enterprise, and the bizarre science officer named Mr. Spock, it was totally retooled into a more action-packed hour of television. However, much like with The Twilight Zone, the science fiction premise helped sneak a lot of headier ideas into some of the episodes, and it was easy to have a diverse cast of characters and actors playing the characters than you would have typically have seen at the time. So this led to the show becoming exceptionally beloved by a very dedicated group of fans. The show was also technically canceled twice, but saved one of those times after the second season thanks to that dedicated group of fans. So the show started with a pair of pilots and ended with a pair of cancellations. In the 70s, the show experienced increased growth of fans through reruns and syndication. To answer this increase of popularity, series creator Gene Roddenberry did 2 things. First, he created an animated series that brought back several of the actors to voice their iconic characters from the original series. Second, he planned a new live-action weekly television series called Star Trek Phase 2. The Enterprise would be refit and rebuilt, and new characters would come in to fill in for the characters who would not return. In the wake of the immense popularity of Star Wars, that series pilot for Star Trek Phase 2 was retooled into a major motion picture for Paramount Pictures, turning into 1979's Star Trek: The Motion Picture. The production of the motion picture was rocky, to say the least. Gene Roddenberry had a reputation for being a little overbearing as an executive producer. He was also known for constantly rewriting and stepping over writers to add things to their original scripts that weren't warranted or appropriate for him to do. It all turned into a bit of a mess behind the scenes. Now, I think the movie is great for several reasons, but it wasn't the high adventure that Star Wars was, and that was a problem in terms of general audiences. So, when 1982 Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan went into production, Roddenberry was forced to take a sideline role that irritated him to no end. And to add insult to injury, the film was wildly successful with fans and critics, making it the most beloved entry of the series, in spite of Roddenberry's attempt to sabotage the film to regain control of his creation. That success more or less made sure that Roddenberry would never have control over any other Trek film that would ever be made afterwards. But Gene wasn't entirely sure at first about the return to TV. You see, Paramount had something incredibly bankable, a franchise that by 1986 was 20 years old, with 79 episodes to sell into rerun syndication whenever they wanted, and 4 very popular and profitable films that sold well to TV, cable, and video stores. They figured it was time to expand, which was very uncommon at that time. Very common today, almost unheard of in 1986. Roddenberry initially tried to stay at arm's length with this new TV series, but then became directly involved after being displeased with some early concept work. But the idea was to set the new series 79 years after Star Trek IV The Voyage Home, or 100 years after the start of the original series. New, mostly bit or unknown actors were hired to take the reins as the new crew of a future USS Enterprise, and Star Trek The Next Generation was born. On September 28, 1987, the first episode, the feature-length Encounter at Farpoint, was aired, introducing us to the new crew of Captain Jean-Luc Picard, Commander William T. Riker, Counselor Deanna Troi, the android Lieutenant Commander Data, Dr. Beverly Crusher and her son Wesley, Lieutenant Tasha Yar, the Klingon Lieutenant Worf, and the blind Lieutenant Geordi LaForge, and a new villain, the godlike Q. The Enterprise was a massive new Galaxy-class ship that also traveled with families and looked kind of like a flying hotel or cruise ship on the inside, with bright lighting and calming beige tones on the walls and in the carpet. The show promised action and adventure in grand Star Trek style. However, the show was met with a 1-2 punch of dissent from fans and a third punch behind the scenes that nearly knocked the series out before it even had a fighting chance. First and foremost, the fans were very loyal to the original crew. After all, these guys were now movie stars with their own beautifully angular and sleek Enterprise. The new crew were, no pun intended, alien to them, and the ship didn't have the same heavy battle cruiser look and feel to it. On top of that, the early episodes weren't entirely well received. And we'll come back around to that in a little bit. But the behind-the-scenes troubles that nearly crashed the show before it could really take off and fly on its own were kind of twofold. The cast and crew were struggling to get along with Roddenberry and his hand-picked showrunners, and the cast struggled to get along with each other. Or more accurately, star Patrick Stewart, playing Captain Picard, who had a Shakespearean stage background, was struggling to get along with his American co-stars and the pace of filming American television episodes. Now, let's get back to one of the issues with the reception of the show. First and foremost, Star Trek The Next Generation is generally known today as the gold standard of the Star Trek television series. But the problem was that people and fans, and I was kind of one of them at one point in time, but I kind of let go of it relatively quickly. But, some people were just not willing to accept a brand new direction for Star Trek. Star Trek was Kirk, Spock, McCoy, Sulu, Scotty, all those guys. These new people could not live up to it, and they just didn't want to see something that didn't have the familiar characters. I mean, the Enterprise was still there, but it didn't even look the same. It didn't even look like it was built by the same people. And I am one of the people who still prefer the original series, even to this day, but I know I'm in the minority, and I still recognize the exceptional writing The Next Generation had on display week after week. But that's how it's viewed today. What most people don't really realize is that it didn't start that way. It is well known within the fandom of Star Trek that the first 2 seasons of Star Trek The Next Generation are pretty bad. Maybe not the worst of the worst there is of Star Trek, but generally disliked and very clunky. Sure, there are bright spots in the first 2 seasons, but of the first 48 episodes that comprise the first 2 seasons, I wouldn't be surprised if 35 of them would be considered among the worst of the entire series, or possibly just simply forgettable, whereas some of the later ones would be unforgettable. And there's one of the earliest episodes considered one of the absolute worst episodes of any Star Trek series ever produced. So to say it was a rocky start would be a galactic understatement. The cast and crew struggled. The fans weren't sure about its quality, production values, and story concepts kind of felt cheap and janky at times. It was struggling. But while some second season episodes like The Measure of a Man would show some promise, the 16th episode of the second season and the 42nd episode overall of the series would introduce an exciting new concept and promise of more stories to tell in the future. And that's our first stop in this month's trip through The Next Generation's 4 Borg stories, 1989's Q Who. So a couple of things about the story to set the stage for where things are in the series. Q was introduced in Encounter at Farpoint, like I said, and reappeared once more in the first season. Now, Q was initially introduced as a judge of humanity. He was kind of part of a group of beings with godlike powers that just generally kind of watched the universe and interjected when they wanted. This specific Q, played by John Delancey, was uniquely interested in this humanity, and that was, kind of out there exploring the universe beyond what he felt was their collective ability to understand what they will run into in the vastness of space. Based on our past wrongdoing to each other and our history of killing each other over land and wars, religious ideology, and things like drugs even, he didn't think we deserved our place on the interstellar stage. So, after Picard's display of, humanity, he decided to simply watch. But the next time he appeared, he was still a villainous kind of trickster-like, almost like Loki in the Marvel Universe, who granted Commander Riker his own powers to give a human a taste of godhood. When Riker ultimately rejected that, he left and hadn't been seen since. In fact, Picard had even told him that he didn't want him to be bothering the ship anymore. And we'll be kind of talking about more about him here in just a bit as we get into the episode. But now the origin of the Borg came from a couple of ideas. First, Gene Roddenberry was not especially interested in reusing alien villains from the original series. Worf was an indication that there was at least some vague alliance between the Federation and the Klingon Empire. Romulans were kept away for the entire first season until the finale of the first season. It was meant for the newly created Ferengi to become the new main villains of the Next Generation, but they turned out to be just kind of comical instead of threatening. So they needed something else, and that brought in another idea from co-executive producer Maurice Hurley to have a race that had a hive consciousness, almost like bugs. There had even been a late first season episode called Conspiracy that had these bugs taking over high-ranking members of Starfleet that were defeated, but upon their defeat, it was revealed that they were sending a message into deep space that seemed to be setting up a promise of an incoming invasion that never really seemed to amount to anything in the long run. However, in the following episode, the season finale, The Neutral Zone, that brought back the Romulans to say that they had several outposts along the Neutral Zone, just like the Federation did, that were attacked and leveled by an unknown villain. The Borg would have made their first appearance there, but the 1988 Writers Guild strike nuked the plans, but it gave writers the chance to refine the idea and introduce the Borg on their own in a single episode of the second season. And here we are, Q Who. This episode aired on May 8th, 1989, and those of us who tuned in had no idea what we were going to be in for over the course of the now 35 years of Star Trek. So, let's dig in. After a clumsy ensign spills hot chocolate onto Captain Picard's uniform, he heads to the turbo lift to return to his quarters to change his uniform, and Picard is surprised to find himself suddenly in Shuttlecraft 6 instead of the hallway of the deck where the officers' quarters are found. Piloting the shuttle is Q. Picard, irritated that this being he thought was in agreement to never trouble the Enterprise ever again, is here, and but he soon discovers that, like a monkey's paw, Q has held to his word by putting the shuttlecraft light years away from the Enterprise. Now, in 10 Forward, the Enterprise's recreational saloon of sorts, Guinan, a mysterious alien played by Whoopi Goldberg, is troubled by an uneasy feeling that she can't quite place. She calls the bridge to ask Commander Riker if there's anything out of the ordinary, but when she's told that everything is fine, she kind of relents and tries to figure out what's going on herself. But soon it's discovered that not only is the captain not able to be found on board, but there's a missing shuttlecraft to boot. And that leads the Enterprise crew to try to figure out what's going on. The shuttle isn't responding to any hails, and no other craft is anywhere near the ship. However, moments later, after constant protest from Picard, Q returns them to the Enterprise and to 10 Forward in an instant. There, Q and Guinan have a confrontation, proving that it was Q that she was sensing. Riker and Worf arrive to find out what Q wants, and Q says he actually wants to join the crew, claiming he's been kicked out of the Q continuum. Picard denies the request pretty much flatly, but Q says that they need him because they are not prepared to encounter what's out there in space. And to prove that they have progressed farther than they have evolved to actually confront at this stage, Q sends the Enterprise 7,000 light years away and 2 years away from the closest Federation starbase. Q leaves after telling Picard it's time to basically prove his hubris, to see if they are truly ready for what they claim that they are ready to encounter out there in the far reaches of space. Now, Guinan's people are from this area of the galaxy, and she warns that if they are smart, they would head back right now and as fast as they can. However, Picard is basically too stubborn and upholds his duty, so he decides to go exploring a bit. And they find a planet that likely would be similar to Earth, with what appears to be roads on the surface of the planet, but scans show that anywhere you would expect to see a city, all the cities have been completely and totally scooped up out of the ground, much like the planets that were found along the neutral zone previously that had been attacked. That's when the Enterprise is probed by a ship that is now on an intercept course. That ship is a perfect cube and without any kind of distinct layout. There's no central bridge, no central engineering section, no living quarters. In fact, they actually can't read any life signs. But there are also no shields or recognizable weapons on the ship. So it doesn't respond to hails, and Guinan tells Picard that the people piloting this cube are called the Borg, and her people encountered them 100 years ago, and they scattered her people all across the galaxy. Despite the Enterprise raising shields to protect themselves from these Borg, a member of that species beams into engineering to take stock of the readouts on the Enterprise's engine core. It's dressed in all black with hoses and mechanical implants sticking out of its lifeless-looking pale flesh. It does not respond to Picard trying to communicate, and Q warns it will attempt to gain control of the ship, and he wouldn't advise that they allow it to do so. So when approached by security, it easily swats the guard away, and when Worf tries shooting the Borg scout, it takes maximum settings on his phaser to destroy the drone. When a second beams aboard, Worf's phaser no longer has any effect, only hitting a shield that appears around the Borg drone. Soon, the second drone collects information from the ship and pieces of implants from the first, and the second drone and the dead drone beam away. Guinan says that the first encounter was to simply gather information. When they decide to attack, they will attack in force. The Borg hail the Enterprise to say they have examined the ship's defensive capabilities, and the Enterprise is not equal to the Borg's technology, and if they try to attack or resist, they will be punished. The Borg then lock onto the ship with a tractor beam, which is also draining their shields. And when the shields are gone, the Borg use a cutting tool to slice into the ship to take a handful of decks away from the Enterprise, seemingly killing 18 people. They finally destroy the beam and decide to go over to the Borg ship to take a look at what they're dealing with, despite Guinan warning against it. When Riker, Data, and Worf beam aboard, they find a whole bunch of Borg, but none of them seem to notice or care that the 3 people from the Enterprise are actually there on board their ship. As the trio explores the ship, they come across the Borg nursery where they find babies with implants plugged into them, meaning that the Borg are born as something other than Borg. They are turned into Borg. Soon, Data discovers that the ship is regenerating and repairing itself, and with this, Picard beams the trio back and immediately takes off to escape the Borg vessel, only to discover that they are being pursued, and the Borg ship can go faster than the Enterprise's maximum speed. The Borg ship knocks them out of warp, and finally, Picard pleads to Q to end this, and Q sends the Enterprise back to where they began, but it is now known that the Borg are aware of their existence, and they will be coming. But let's talk about the 3 things I like about Q Who. First, I actually like the kind of everyday business we see in the episode before it gets into the horror of the Borg encounter. The episode begins like it's any other day. A new graduate of Starfleet Academy is in engineering with Geordi, and she's rambling on and trying to desperately prove her worth. Only to really kind of make bad first impressions. That leads to Picard getting her hot chocolate all over him and his stern interaction with her and Geordi. Now, bookmark that for a moment, as we'll be mirroring that interaction in just a moment. But then that moves to 10 forward, where now we bring in Guinan in on this kind of story, as she'll be a key figure in all of this, but she's just doing normal 10 forward business, serving up cocktails like it's any other day, which will have a massive impact on the future of the Federation, Starfleet, and each and every person on board the Enterprise on this specific day. So it starts like it's just a normal old day for everybody. But even in the encounter with the Borg, when their ship cuts into the Enterprise with their laser beam, it's important to understand there were 18 people who were essentially killed, maybe, probably not, as we find out later what the Borg really are, but while they're doing their everyday business. It's just a lost art in television writing to feature these kinds of things happening to characters underneath a main plot and main business of the episode. It helps build to the ultimate discovery that is the Borg and the terror that they're going to be for decades to come in Star Trek's continuity. But it all started with everything just being a normal day. Second, I remember watching this episode when it premiered. The title involving Q and the early part of the story dealing with him was a great misdirect. I mean, this was Q's return. Yay! You know, I wonder what the mischief he's going to be causing this time. But oh no. He shows us this cube, and what is inside that cube is damn cool. The Borg are kind of the ultimate nightmare for those people terrified of technology being used to enhance our existence. Humanity, or something resembling humanity, as in the Borg drones, but the drone's skin is deathly pale and mostly covered up with their implants and their technology. And their suits kind of look like they would do pretty well in a fetish club somewhere in the wild part of town. But then, already knowing what I mentioned earlier, the Enterprise is massively large compared to past iterations of our hero ship on Star Trek, with nearly 3 times as many souls on board. And the Borg travel around in a giant cube that dwarfs the Enterprise and is laid out in a way that can hold so many more beings on it than the Enterprise can. The Borg look and seem human, their own, their one mind, collective seems to be what we all hope for, to be able to, all be able to decide and do what's best for all of us as a humanity, to kind of work in a commune. But the Borg are perverted into being unfeeling, codependent, and lacking any individual personality. It's a terrifying concept as a human with feelings and emotions to see the Borg in such legion of nameless, near faceless creatures that just want what we have so they can use it solely for their own needs until there's nothing left of what we had. They are so cold, and it's so cool how much we get from them in such little time in this episode. Only about half the episode is actually dedicated to them. And the misdirect that we think it's Q coming back to do more shenanigans is how we get here to meeting the biggest villain of the Next Generation era of Star Trek. It's a great introduction. And thirdly, speaking of Q and that misdirect and the way we first see Picard in this episode, let's talk about his speech to save the crew at the end of the episode. The entire episode sees Picard as the staunch, kind of stiff upper lip and proud captain we've seen him throughout the series up to this point. He puts the fear of that ensign's career into her at the beginning of the episode. He continuously defies Q. He sticks to his duty to explore despite Guinan telling him to get the hell out of here before the Borg find them. He's unmovable and unbreakable. He, doesn't even take time to mourn the 18 lost souls from the attack. And then, when it's very clear the Borg will destroy the Enterprise and kill all of them, which we will find out later is what likely happened to those 18 casualties, and what would have happened to the rest of the Enterprise crew if Q didn't set things right again, Picard blinks. First, he tries to be coy with Q before it devolves into begging for Q's assistance to save them. I mean, he's not the steadfast and rigid captain anymore. He's actually frightened. The lines Stewart speaks are, if we all die here now, you will not have the ability, not be able to gloat. You wanted to frighten us? We're frightened. You wanted to show us that we are inadequate for the moment? I grant that. You wanted me to say, I need you? I need you. The lines are great. The delivery from Patrick Stewart is great. And even though it's a, Deus Ex Machina to save the crew, it's effective as hell and puts a wonderful cap to this great episode of The Next Generation. It shows that, this was a time in, as Picard says, they needed a kick in their complacency, because the Next Generation was without war and without a lot of, direct conflict. Starfleet got very complacent, and they weren't ready for something, as Q called, would be the ultimate users that would take everything that they have and use it up until it's no good to them anymore. And when they're done with it, there won't be humanity left behind. It's a great way to introduce the Borg, but it's a great way to introduce that Picard finally understands that his hubris is there, and he is not prepared for what they're about to find. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new reviews every Friday morning. Next time, we move on to the next appearance of the Borg in Star Trek The Next Generation, and it is one of the crown jewels of the TNG episodes, and still one of the greatest cliffhangers in the history of television. Join me as I discuss the best of both worlds. Until next week, stay spooky.